Washington, District of Columbia, in the closing weeks of 1881. A 56-year-old man named Cyrus Thomas accepts a federal appointment that will occupy the rest of his working life. He has been an entomologist, a lawyer, a Lutheran minister, and a state agricultural official, and he has come to archaeology the way a great many 19th-century Americans came to it, sideways and late. John Wesley Powell, head of the new Bureau of Ethnology, puts him in charge of a single division with a single question to answer. Congress has appropriated money to resolve the matter of the mounds, and Thomas is the man who will spend it. Thomas already believes he knows what he will find. He wrote it down without hedging. He arrived at the Bureau, in his own words, a pronounced believer in the existence of a race of mound builders distinct from the American Indians, a lost people, a civilization that rose across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, built in earth on a scale that astonished everyone who came upon it, and then went out of the world completely, leaving the continent to somebody else. That was not a fringe position in 1881. It was the ordinary opinion of educated Americans, taught in schools, repeated from the floor of Congress, and printed by the Smithsonian institution itself. What nobody understood that winter, Thomas least of all, was what 12 years of turning over the ground would do to the man holding the shovel. Before any of the theories, there is the earth itself. Across the eastern half of North America, from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, tens of thousands of earthen structures were raised over a span of over 3,000 years. Some are conical burial mounds no taller than a person. Others are among the largest earthen constructions on the planet. At Cahokia, on the Illinois floodplain across the river from present-day St. Louis, Monk's Mound rises about 100 feet and covers a footprint larger than the base of the Great Pyramid at Giza. Around it once stood a city. In the 12th century, Cahokia held a population comparable to London at the same moment. In Adams County, Ohio, the Serpent Mound uncoils along a ridge for some 1,300 feet. At Newark, Ohio, a complex of precise circles, squares, and an octagon once spread across several square miles, and the octagon is a line to the northernmost rising of the moon, an event that repeats on a cycle of a little over 18.5 years. In northeastern Louisiana, the concentric ridges of Poverty Point were raised roughly 3,400 years ago, which places them a few centuries earlier than the reign of Rameses II. All of it was carried by hand, one basket load at a time, in the millions. And the builders were not a mystery. They were the ancestors of nations that exist today, among them the Osage, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Muskogee, the Ho-Chunk, the Shawnee, and the Cherokee. Their descendants were living within a day's ride of these sites the entire time the argument was going on. The first serious American attempt to record the earthworks came out of Chillicothe, Ohio, in the middle 1840s. Ephraim Squire was a newspaper editor with a taste for antiquities. Edwin Davis was a physician who had been walking the local earthworks since boyhood. Between 1845 and 1847, the two of them went into the field with surveying chains, and did the work nobody had done properly, measuring, sectioning, and drawing more than 200 sites. Their manuscript went to Joseph Henry, the Smithsonian's first secretary, in May of 1847. On the 1st of December 1848, it was published as the opening volume of Smithsonian Contributions to Knowledge, with 48 lithographic plates and 207 wood engravings. It was the Smithsonian's very first book. Reading the plates now is like leafing through the field record of an expedition to a country that has since been paved. The surveying holds up. Modern archaeologists still use those measurements, because for a great many of those sites the measurements are all that survives. The conclusion does not hold up at all. Squire and Davis opened by insisting they had no hypothesis to combat or sustain, and then produced a book arguing that the builders were a distinct and more advanced people, plausibly connected to the civilizations of Mexico and Central America, and certainly not the ancestors of the native nations living around them. The idea was older than their book. What Squire and Davis added was the best evidence it would ever have, and the Smithsonian's name on the cover. Once the lost race existed as a premise, the only remaining question was who they had been, and 19th century America answered with tremendous enthusiasm and very little discipline. In 1787, a writer proposed the Danes. In 1812, another argued for the Welsh, arriving under a 12th century prince named Madoc, who almost certainly never existed. Caleb Atwater, a postmaster in Circleville, Ohio, published a substantial survey in 1820 and concluded the builders had come from Hindustan. Others favored the Phoenicians on the grounds that the Phoenicians sailed everywhere. Others preferred the 10 lost tribes of Israel, which had the advantage of scriptural weight. Later in the century, once Atlantis had been thoroughly popularized, the Atlanteans were added to the roster. There is a pattern running through every one of these proposals, and it is easier to see at a distance of a century and a half. Danes, Welsh, Phoenicians, Israelites, Atlanteans, every one of them arrives by boat, from somewhere across an ocean. Not one theory, in all those decades of speculation, proposed that the people who built the mounds were from the place where the mounds are. By the middle of the century, the lost race had acquired a physical description as well. In popular accounts, they became fair-skinned, they became tall, and in the more excitable versions, they became giants, a claim that would take on a life entirely its own. None of it rested on evidence. All of it rested on an assumption so complete that the men making it could not see it as an assumption. A wrong idea can persist for a long time on inertia alone. This one did not need inertia. It was earning its keep. On the 6th of December 1830, 7 months after signing the Indian Removal Act, President Andrew Jackson delivered his annual message to Congress. In it, he celebrated the progress of removal, and he reached for the mounds to do it. In the monuments and fortifications of an unknown people spread across the West, he told Congress, "The nation beheld the memorials of a once powerful race, which was exterminated or has disappeared to make room for the existing savage tribes." Every listener understood the reference. The lost race of the mound builders had been in the newspapers and the school books for 30 years. Follow the logic to its end, because the whole century turns on it. If a civilized people once held this land, and if the native nations now living on it were the ones who destroyed them, then those nations were not the original inhabitants at all. They were occupiers. Under that reading, removal stopped being conquest and became correction. It restored a continent to the kind of people who had cultivated it before. What actually happened to the Muskogee, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole is documented in detail. Treaties were signed and broken. Land was taken by statute and by force. Thousands of people died on forced marches west. The removals ran for decades, and the deaths ran into the many thousands. The theory did not do the removing. Its work was quieter and more durable, and it supplied the story that let a nation carry the removals out and describe itself as reasonable while doing so. It spread because it was useful, and useful ideas do not need to be true to travel. An idea that popular creates an appetite is a market. In October of 1869, workers digging a well behind a farmhouse near Cardiff, New York, struck stone in the shape of a man over 10 feet tall. Word went out within hours. The farmer put up a tent and charged admission, first 25 cents and soon 50, and the crowds came by the wagon load. Phineas Barnum tried to buy it, failed, and simply built a copy that drew crowds of its own. The Cardiff giant was a block of gypsum quarried in Iowa, carved in a Chicago workshop, aged with acid and sand, and buried on the farm a year in advance by a man named George Hull, who had cooked the whole scheme up after arguing with a revivalist preacher about the giants mentioned in Genesis. The confession came within months. The crowds kept coming anyway. Cardiff had nothing to do with the mounds, but it demonstrated exactly how much the American public wanted ancient giants to exist, and the newspapers had already learned the same lesson closer to home. Through the 1800s, small-town papers ran a steady traffic in reports of enormous skeletons pulled from mounds and gravel pits. The measurements grew with each retelling. The bones themselves were never available for examination. The correspondents were rarely named, and the accounts drifted from paper to paper, losing whatever thin sourcing they began with. Those reports described graves, real ones in many cases, belonging to real people whose descendants are living now. The remains that actually came out of mounds were ordinary human remains of ordinary human size, and they deserved better than a headline. No giant human skeleton has ever been recovered from a North American mound, because there were never any there to recover. John Wesley Powell had lost most of his right arm at Shiloh, and had run the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon in 1869 with a one-armed man's stubbornness and 9 other men. In 1879 he became the first head of the Bureau of Ethnology, and he had already made up his mind about the mounds. Powell called the lost race theory a romantic fallacy and said so in print. When Congress appropriated money in 1881 to answer the mound question, Powell had an obvious move available. He could have handed the survey to somebody who agreed with him and received the answer he expected within a year. He handed it to Cyrus Thomas instead. Thomas had done a little mound digging in the Midwest around 1860, and what he found there had left him more confused than certain, since some of the material appeared to be European in origin. He had gone on believing in the lost race regardless. He was, by his own description, pronounced in that belief when he walked through the Bureau's door. Powell gave him 3 field assistants, 1 clerk, and instructions to design a survey. Whether Powell chose him for his organizational ability or for the particular value of a believer's signature on a negative finding, the record does not say. What is documented is the result. A skeptic proving a myth false convinces the people who already agreed. A believer working for 12 years and reporting against himself is a different kind of document entirely. The first field season opened in 1882 and the work ran until 1890. Thomas was an organizer rather than a digger. He designed the program, deployed the assistants, collected their notebooks, and built the synthesis. Men like Gerard Folk, Henry Reynolds, John Rogan, and James Middleton did the field work, moving through the Ohio Valley, the Southeast, the Mississippi Bottoms, the Appalachian Hollows, and up into the Great Lakes. By the end, the Division of Mound Exploration had examined roughly 2,000 mound sites across 21 states, and accessioned upward of 40,000 artifacts. Nothing on that scale had been attempted before in American archaeology, and the field notes filling the Smithsonian's boxes remain the primary documentation for sites that no longer exist above ground. The methods matter as much as the numbers. The assistants recorded stratigraphy, rather than simply emptying mounds for objects. They noted what lay above and below what. They compared construction techniques across regions. They read the 16th century Spanish chronicles, including the accounts from the De Soto expedition, which described native towns of the southeast with chiefs' houses standing on raised earthen platforms, built by hand, in use at the moment Europeans first saw them. And it needs saying plainly that this was excavation of graves. Ancestral graves opened without the consent of descendant communities, at a time when no law required that consent and no scientist thought to ask. The 40,000 artifacts are a record of the work, and also of what the work cost. American law did not begin to address any of it until the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990, and the repatriation of those collections is still going on today. The turn shows up in print well before the final report. In the Bureau's 5th annual report, published in 1887, Thomas laid out more than 100 pages of preliminary conclusions. He hedged carefully, as a man does when he is describing the collapse of something he used to hold. He wrote that he now opposed the lost race theory and believed the Indian theory to be the correct one, and he added that he was not wedded to it, and that he was willing to follow the facts wherever they might lead. They led in one direction only, and by 1894 he had stopped hedging. The report on the mound explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology appeared that year in the Bureau's 12th annual report, running to page 730. Thomas built the case mound by mound. The earthworks were not the product of one people or one era, but of many peoples across thousands of years, with local styles and local materials and clear regional development. European trade goods appeared in some mounds, meaning those mounds had been raised after contact. Burial practices, pottery, tools, and construction techniques ran continuously from the mound building periods into the historical native cultures of the same regions. The Spanish chroniclers had described mound use as a living practice. His conclusion was that there existed an unbroken chain connecting the mound builders and the historical Indians. There was no lost race. There had never been a lost race. The people who built the mounds had not disappeared, had not been exterminated by anyone, and had not come from across any ocean. They were the ancestors of the nations that Americans had spent the century removing from the land those mounds stood on. Cyrus Thomas had been hired to describe a vanished white civilization. He spent 12 years and a congressional appropriation looking for it, and then he wrote 700 pages explaining in detail why it did not exist. A federal monograph is no match for a good story, and the 1894 report proved it. Within professional archaeology, the question was settled, and it has stayed settled for more than 130 years. reinforced by every method invented since, including radiocarbon dating, and more recently by genetic evidence. Outside the profession, the lost race carried on with barely a limp. It stayed in popular books and schoolroom lore for decades. It fed a steady supply of newspaper filler. It found new hosts wherever an audience wanted the earthworks to belong to somebody else. The modern version arrives as photographs, enormous skeletons in excavation pits, shovels and clipboards beside them for scale, circulating with captions about suppressed discoveries. The images are digital composites, and a number of them originated as entries in graphic design contests, before being cut loose from their captions. Alongside them run screenshots of genuine 19th-century newspaper clippings, which were unreliable when they were printed and have not improved with age. The claim attached to the photographs is usually that the Smithsonian is hiding the evidence. That is the part worth sitting with. The institution accused of concealing the giants is the institution that published the 700-page report explaining why there are none, and that report has been freely available to anybody who wanted to read it since the year it came out. The giants were never a discovery that got buried. They were a story that got repeated, and the difference between those two things is the entire story. While the argument ran its course, the evidence was disappearing under it. Ohio alone once held somewhere between 10 and 15,000 earthworks. The great majority are gone, flattened for farmland, quarried for fill, graded for railbeds, subdivided into streets and parking lots. Squire and Davis mapped sites in the 1840s that had already been damaged by the plough, and for a considerable number of those sites their drawings are now the only surviving trace that anything ever stood there. The expedition record outlived the country it described. Cahokia lost mounds to highway construction into the middle of the 20th century. Across the Mississippi and Ohio valleys, the same story repeated with local variations for 150 years. Some of it survives. Cahokia, Poverty Point, and the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks all now hold World Heritage inscription, the last of them added in 2023, and descendant nations are directly involved in the stewardship of sites their ancestors built. The rest was lost during the long stretch of years, when the country could not decide whether the mounds belonged to anybody at all. Go back to Washington in the winter of 1881, and the man walking into the Bureau of Ethnology with his mind made up. He was 56 years old. He believed in a lost race. He had said so in print, and the entire weight of respectable American opinion was standing behind him. He was handed public money, 3 assistants, and 12 years. He could have found what he was looking for. Plenty of men in that century did, working from thinner evidence than he had. Instead, he went into the ground 2,000 times, read what was actually there, and published the finding that ruined his own position and closed the question for good. The giants are not real, and they never were, but the story of who needed them and what that need was used to justify did happen, and it is stranger and heavier than any skeleton would have been. The mounds are still standing where they can be. They were built by people whose descendants are alive and can tell you their names. And the record that says so, 730 pages of it, has been sitting on the shelf open since 1894.